this. Let's get ready to, I can't say rumble because I think that I would actually be infringing on somebody's copyright. But nonetheless, we have a lot to talk about in a very short period of time today. So I want to talk a little bit about some current events that are going on globally. Some current events that are going on globally. We've had a lot of stuff in the last couple of weeks that has really been pushed right into our lap for this semester. It's been heaven sent. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is some of the riots and protests that have been going on in Brazil. What's been going on in Brazil? Tell me why and what has been going on in Brazil. Anybody online? This is critical to understanding one of the topics that we're going to be talking about today, which is political economics. Political economics on a global stage. On a global stage. Political economics as it relates to the global stage. So I've got Tim that's typing. What's going on right now in Brazil? Why is this so important? The World Cup preparations have raised business prices, so that is one thing they're upset about. Okay, so you're absolutely right, Tim. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of things going on in Brazil right now that are upsetting to Brazilians. Now, one of them is Brazil. First of all, let's put it into context. Brazil is a democracy. Brazil is a democracy, but in many ways and in many cases, it's almost like there are, for a lack of a better term, gangs that are running their political ideology, their political, like Democrats and Republicans. What's the word I'm looking for? Political parties. And so there is no referendum. They don't necessarily get to vote on who's going to actually be running. And, so there are a lot of issues with corruption. There are a lot of issues with corruption. So the problem that we're seeing here in Brazil is, sure, you're seeing some issues associated with FIFA and the Olympics. FIFA in itself, this is the soccer league of the world, one of the largest businesses, one of the largest and most powerful organizations in the world, in itself is a cartel. In itself is a cartel. And not much different than, say, the NFL or NBA. I mean, they control a lot and yield a lot of power, right? Well, what's going on in Brazil is you're having the Olympics, and then you're also having FIFA step in, which is known to be corrupt, and the politicians have decided to withdraw $14 billion. $14 billion. Now, it might not seem like a lot of money here in the United States because our government spends it like it's going out of style, but in Brazil and in the United States, it is a significant sum. And that $14 billion is earmarked for stadium improvements for the Olympics. It's earmarked for FIFA and the soccer stadiums. But the problem is that many of the poor individuals in Brazil and the middle class and even the upper class have united against the corruption because they know of that $14 billion that's going towards stadiums. That money could be going towards hospitals. That money could be going towards education. That money could be going towards infrastructure. And the poor public services that Chris mentions, are very little, if any, money of that money is going to that particular sector, public services or education. This is one of the dynamics of political economics. So you have politics and you have economics that are tied together. And it seems like politics and economics have always been tied together throughout history. And in Brazil, they are protesting inequality. They're protesting corruption. They're protesting lack of infrastructure. They're protesting bribery. And it seems that in Brazil, although they have a democracy, they don't have the vote and the power that they thought that they should, that the people think that they should have. And that's a big problem. And you're seeing that in other countries. You saw that 2 years ago in what was called the Arab Spring that started out in Egypt. The Arab Spring began in Egypt, and that was a revolt, and it was a riot, and it was a protest against Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt at the time, where the citizens were saying, hey, listen, we're working our tail off and we're not getting anything for it. And there's a huge disparity between the upper class and the lower class. And part of this has to do a little bit with globalization. Part of this has to do with globalization, in that there is exploitation of other multinational corporations coming in and being able to bribe or work with the politicians. And they said, this is enough. We have had enough. And that spread throughout. And now what is it that we have going on in Syria? You have a civil war in Syria going on right now, and it's been going on actively for a year. You're seeing political and economic corruption within governments, and people are saying we've had enough. And what's interesting is at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about the democratization, and today's topic is political economics, right? And what we talked about at the very beginning of the semester was, here we go, Ben, a trifecta of the democratization. I don't know if you remember the democratization of what of finance, technology, and information. Well, they have the ability now to communicate. They have the ability to organize through technology. Quick question. The NCAA is being sued because they are using likeness of college athletes in video games and products, but they are not seeing any of the profit. Yeah, and very good, Ben. You had technology and information. I see that. You are seeing the NCAA, and the NCAA acts as somewhat as a cartel as well, right? You're seeing a lot of these professional organizations behave as if they were untouchable. And FIFA globally is one of those organizations. And what's going on in Brazil is the individuals are saying, hey, wait a minute. FIFA, which behaves badly regularly, and there's plenty of corruption, is coming in and dictating what it is that they want from us, and our politicians are then accepting it. It's an insult, an affront to Brazilians that an outside organization would come in and dictate what the stadium was going to be like, how much money is going to be spent. And they're saying, where's my share? Where's my infrastructure? Where is my health, hospitals, healthcare, etc.? Where is that? And the politicians are lining their pockets with more and more funds, partially from external sources and much of it from internal sources like the government. Just allocated right out of the budget. Somehow it has to pass through a politician, or it gets to a politician as a kickback. But either way, it ends up in a politician's hand. There's also more and more, you're seeing more and more bad behavior being filmed by politicians or families of politicians. So for instance, in Mexico, about a year ago, a young woman who belonged to a wealthy family whose father was, I believe, a commissioner of health, was not able to get a seat in a restaurant in a timely manner or the seat that she wanted. And she protested and said, "You don't know who I am. You don't know my family. I'm going to shut your restaurant down." And she was being filmed with a cell phone, an iPhone. She was being filmed the entire time. And what happened? 2 days later, the health department shut the restaurant down. The health department shut the restaurant down, and this video was presented to the Mexican people. It was presented on YouTube, and it caused a huge firestorm of corruption. You're seeing a lot of very typical bad behavior now being videotaped, and now people are fighting back through technology. You're seeing all sorts of this bad behavior. And this is all a dynamic of political economics. Now let's take another look. So the gentleman who leaked the NSA documents, and for some reason I've been reading about him every single day, several hours a day. I can't remember his name. It starts with an S. You remember it, Robert? Chris is giving me the name. But this gentleman, Snowden, there we go. This gentleman is now causing a global event. This is not just within the United States. You have agreements and you have courtesies that other countries, and treaties, more importantly, that are written, that countries have between each other. And whether Mr. Snowden is right, wrong, or indifferent, he is a fugitive of justice in the United States. So his first stop was Hong Kong, where he released the classified information to The Guardian or WikiLeaks or whoever it was. And the United States government filed the paperwork necessary to have him extradited. And what did Hong Kong then do? What did China do? They delayed the paperwork and allowed Mr. Snowden to leave the country, kind of a poke in the finger of the eye of the United States. It seems like China And then who's the other axis that we talk about? What's the other country that likes to try to poke the finger in the eye of the United States when it gets a chance? Russia. Exactly, Artemis, Russia. And who also has an interest in the classified information that he has on his 4 laptops? It's Russia and China. Clearly, they may have had the opportunity to download all of that information. So Putin allows Snowden to enter into Russia, and the U.S. is saying, wait a minute, China, how could you let him go in the first place? So you have some political issues going on. But the undertones and the threats are economic, possibly economic issues. Because that's how countries battle each other nowadays, is through economic issues. And we call these issues NTBs. Non-tariff barriers. And these barriers come in many different shapes and sizes. And I'm going to list a few. Import quotas. How about customs procedures? Customs procedures. How about regulations varying from health to safety, etc. We're going to say labeling and then etc. When the United States has issues, or when China has issues, they look at some of these non-tariff barriers and they say, we're not going to put a tax on you, but you know what? We know how you value exporting pork bellies to us. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to put a quota. Or instead of a quota, we're going to say, look, you know what? We've changed the labeling requirements. So now you're going to have to put a new label, and you're going to have to submit it to us and this agency over here. And we haven't fully defined it, but now you can't really bring anything in until you have met those labeling requirements. Those orders are no longer being fulfilled, and that puts economic pressure on the politicians also. Countries are looking at, and right now I can tell you that the U.S. government, and there are certain politicians that are looking at non-tariff barriers that they might be able to combat. Now, we're not talking about a full-fledged war, right? But we're looking at little ways that countries get back at each other, and it seems somewhat petty, and in my opinion it is. We need to be bigger than that, and we probably will be in the United States. But the reality of it is, these are tools that are used by governments when things don't necessarily go their way. And there are diplomatic issues right now that are forming, and that actually have already been in the works for many, many years between the United States and China. We have issues with each other. They run a communist. They have a very strong communist government, centralized. The United States has a democracy, but we both have capitalistic capitalistic economic systems, right? We both have capitalistic economic systems. And now we've got an issue with Russia. And again, these are ongoing issues with Russia. We have a very, very different opinion on Syria. Why would Russia, for those of you who are not fully aware, why would Russia side with the, we'll call it, dictatorship of Syria? Why would they side with Syrian government officials and provide assistance to those government officials? What does Russia have into it besides poking their finger in the eye of the United States and many parts of the European Union? Why is this? Because Syrian officials have an agreement? Yeah, possibly, but Syria holds a key tactical position for the Russian government in the form of a military base. And if that government falls, so does too their tactical position of a military base in Syria. And China, who is also part of the World Trade Organization and also part of the UN, says, no, let the Syrians do what the Syrians are going to do. And they're killing many of their citizens. The government is killing many of their citizens. And now we have Tim telling me that Moscow does not believe that Mr. Snowden has committed a crime in Russia, and therefore he will not be arrested because there is no extradition treaty between the United States and Russia. So it's not just a poke in the eye, is it? It doesn't seem like it's just a poke in the eye with the Russians into the U.S. It is more of a poke in the eye. It's stomp on the foot and maybe some Three Stooges slapping around, right? Now you're going to get into some diplomatic issues. You're going to get into some serious diplomatic issues, and these issues are going to possibly manifest themselves in economic trade. In economic trade. And let me put this in perspective. In pre-2008, you had commodity prices. And let me ask you this first. What is a commodity? We need to understand the importance of commodities in the global playing field. What is a commodity? Tell me what a commodity is. Stuff that we use every day. Let's just be more specific. Not necessarily, it could be a good, not necessarily a service, but what I'm talking about is oil, gas, corn, etc. What was the question that I saw earlier? Artemis, because the Syrian officials have an agreement. Let me see here. Right above that? What are import quotas? Excellent. I thought we had gone over this, but I will go through it again. And it's a fair question, Artemis. Import quotas are, let me give you an example. So let's put import quotas on this piece of paper. Good question. I love it. Import quotas are similar to restrictions on the amount of goods or services coming into a country. So, for instance, the example that I believe that I had given was Harley Davidson and Honda motorcycles, the big motorcycles, right? The heavy motorcycles. So Honda started coming into the market with their heavy motorcycles, which were more efficient. They were better on fuel. They did not break down as much. They were great motorcycles. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the Honda makes a good motorcycle, and it's a big motorcycle. And they were starting to take market share away from Harley Davidson, and Harley Davidson said, wait a minute. We are the great American sacred cow. You need to protect us, Congress. So Congress said, wait a minute, this is one of the last American-made motorcycle companies. We need to protect them. So what they did is they put a quota on Honda on their motorcycles and said, look, if you exceed a certain amount of heavy motorcycles into the United States in a given time frame, we'll say that's a year, then you're going to get a tariff. We're going to start imposing penalties on your motorcycles. And so what did Honda do? Honda said, oh, okay, great. And they continued to exceed that quota. They continued to exceed that number. And they were given penalties. And Harley Davidson was saying, well, this isn't working. This is not working. They continued to exceed, and I know they're being taxed, and I know that you're putting some financial penalties on them, but they have money. They can pay it. So then Congress said, look, if you exceed this quota, we're going to start imposing financial penalties on what's most important to you. And what is the most important good that Honda exports to the United States? What is the most important good that Honda exports to the United States? Cars. Cars, right? And so that got Honda's attention, because now their cars would become more expensive, because Honda just passes on those penalties in the form of taxes onto the consumer. And so Honda then very quickly agreed to the quota, thus allowing Harley Davidson, the sacred cow, to compete on an unlevel playing field. And little does everyone know that what percentage of a Harley Davidson is made in the U.S.? What percentage of a Harley Davidson is made in the U.S.? 11%, 10%, you're exactly right. So an import quota, or a quota, is a limit. It's a limit on goods. It's a limit on goods or services coming into a country. You see how non-tariff barriers work? You see that these penalties can turn into duties or customs, or in the sense of customs, you could have, or in speaking about customs, you could have goods coming in from China that are then held up in customs. Or you could have goods coming in from a country that are deliberately held up through the paperwork and red tape. The paperwork and red tape. Great question. Now, back to Russia. So pre-2008, pre-October of 2008, the black swan landed on the United States economy, and essentially a lot of Western Europe and Russia landed on the black swan. The financial crisis landed in October of 2008. But prior to that, commodity prices were flying through the roof. Oil was at $145 a barrel at its high. Gasoline, we were paying what we're paying now, it seems like, but we were paying north of $4. In California, it was closer to $5. Concrete, Cemex, the largest concrete, we'll say, manufacturer company in the world, out of Mexico. In 2006 and 2007, there was a shortage of lumber and concrete in the U.S. Do any of you remember this? There was a shortage of all of these building materials. And those building materials were going to China to build their infrastructure, and they were paying top dollar. And because oil was at all-time highs, Russia, Venezuela, they were flexing their muscles and saying, you know what, we have you. We own you. You need our gas, our natural gas. Putin was strangling certain countries by saying, we're not going to deliver you this natural gas. We're not going to give you as much oil as you want. And we love the prices up here. We're making money hand over fist, and we have the flexibility. We're on top of the world. And Russia has a lot of natural resources, gas, natural gas, oil, etc., etc. And then what happened in 2008? The black swan landed on the economy. Prices fell dramatically. I believe Brent crude oil, which is the cleanest oil that you can get, dropped to $80 a barrel. Right now, I believe it's at around 101. Brent crude oil is around $101 a barrel. A far cry from 145. And because the global crisis caused a slowdown in demand, that seriously affected Putin's and Hugo Chavez's. No relation, by the way, I'm not related. But they didn't have that money coming in. And it seems like they'll do almost anything they can to stick their finger in our eye. And it has not only political ramifications, but it has economic ramifications. It has economic ramifications. Let's talk a little bit about what political economics is. A little more in terms of, we've been talking about it. And political economics, and I'm going to call it international political economics, is essentially parallel existence and mutual interaction of the state and markets. And what's interesting here is you have to have both. You have to have both. We're not necessarily going to cover voodoo economics, Ben, but I can tell you that the trickle-down theory of economics doesn't really work. And that's where you don't tax the wealthy. And this isn't a political statement by me. I'm not expressing my political views. I'm expressing my economic views. So let me give you an example. The trickle-down theory of economics states essentially that if you don't tax the wealthy will then spend more money, and that will stimulate the economy. More people will have to be hired because the wealthy are spending more money, et cetera, et cetera. Let's look at this. Look at Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest men in the world. He buys a new Buick every couple of years. He's lived in the same house for 40 years. He's probably wearing the same clothes from 30, 40 years ago. Now, granted, his financial enterprises are regularly buying and selling, but that's business. That's not him personally. He's not spending a lot of money personally. And look at it, let's look at it from a third world perspective. Carlos Slim, who is, I believe, the wealthiest man in the world. I think Forbes put Bill Gates back up there. But the wealthiest man in the world, he too has lived in the same house in the same neighborhood for the last 40 years. These individuals aren't spending a lot of money to stimulate the economy. You're seeing, if that was true, the wealth disparity in Mexico is unbelievable. Unbelievable. The same in Saudi Arabia. The same in Brazil. You have a very small group of individuals that have a tremendous amount of wealth. King and queen type wealth, emperor type wealth. And if it really truly trickled down, wouldn't the entire country benefit? Doesn't seem to work too well. But that's the political economic system of Mexico. That's the political economic system of Brazil. There's a huge gap between the lower income and upper income individuals. And I don't use the word, especially globally, I don't use the word class between the upper class and lower class. I don't use the word class because to me class refers to not poor or rich, but class refers to someone's position in society. And I prefer to use, and I have a very high regard for individuals. Let's take teachers. They especially, they don't make a lot of money, but I have a very high regard for them. So although in many cases individuals may refer to them as lower class, I consider them to be upper class citizens. But they economically are very, very poor. And that's why I need more pastries. I need to be fed, as Ben states. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, I want to give you a definition of economics, because we are talking about commodities. And I want to go back to commodities. And first, we're going to talk about economics. What's the definition of economics? The definition of economics, as I learned it, was the study of the allocation of scarce resources. The study of allocation of scarce resources. This was my definition given to me when I was in college. The study of the allocation of scarce resources. The real world, international, global definition that I have come to appreciate is this. Okay? The study of the allocation of scarce resources. And I have added to this, but by scarce, I do not mean rare. I mean valuable. What do I mean by this? What do I mean by this? The study of the allocation of scarce resources. But by scarce, I don't mean rare, I mean valuable. Tell me something that is not rare, but highly valuable. Tell me something that is not scarce, but valuable. Give me an example. Water. Diamonds. Absolutely, diamonds. De Beers, the largest mining company in the world of diamonds, has warehouses upon warehouses filled with diamonds. And you say, well, why don't they just let them out into the market? Because if they flooded the market, what would happen to the price of diamonds? And as it is, diamonds are a dime a dozen. You know what is rare? Colored gems. Colored diamonds. Colored gems, colored diamonds. A few years ago, I believe it was the country of Zimbabwe, the dictator had decided that he was going to sell and flood the market with diamonds in order to help feed his people. He himself was tremendously corrupt. And the world community, let me qualify that, the world diamond community protested. And they said, if anyone buys these diamonds, you're buying blood diamonds. So there was a perception that now, wow, I'm buying blood diamonds, so I'm not going to buy them. Oil, as Tim says, is another commodity that is not rare but valuable. Have you noticed that oil prices have gone from $145 plus down to $100, but our gasoline prices have not fallen commensurately? Have you noticed this? Have you noticed that our oil prices at the beginning of this session today, I purposely stated that oil Brent crude was trading at around $101 a barrel. What are you paying at the gas pump today? $3.69 in Arizona? $3.79? And what were you paying when they were at $145 a barrel? You were paying $4. $4.10, $4.09, $4.19. Why is it that we haven't seen gasoline prices tumble along with oil prices? Isn't that what the media associates globally with? The global output is linear to our price at the pump. That's what we're taught in the media. That's what we're supposed to believe. The problem is, it is not oil. Oil is in abundance. There's plenty of oil in the world. What is it that we put in our vehicles? It's gasoline. Gasoline is what we put in our vehicles to get them to go. We do not have the refineries capable of refining all of the oil that's coming into the U.S. from Canada. So the supply levels are always tenuous at best. The supply levels are always marginal. There is not a huge amount of supply. And you say, well, that's not fair. Well, that's business. The government doesn't control the refining process. The government doesn't control it. It's companies like Exxon and Chevron and British Petroleum that say, hey, we want to open up a refinery. And if they open up more refineries, what would happen to the price of gasoline? It would go down, it would tank. So let me see, if I'm the CEO of Exxon, and I'm also, and Robert here is the CEO of, say, Chevron or Texaco or whoever, how quickly are we going to be to open up more refineries? Because aren't our profits predicated on the price of gasoline? The higher the price, the what? The more profits I make. It is a tacit collusion. Do you know the last time a refinery has been built in the United States? Look it up, Google it. 40 years ago. 40 years ago, might be closer to 35, 40 years ago, was the last time a refinery turning oil into gasoline was built in the United States. And yet we hear people say, drill, drill, we need to become independent of foreign oil. Well, oil, you can't put that in your gas tank. And here's another piece of news for you to give you a global perspective. If we were to drill for more oil in the United States or in Alaska, supply and demand dictates that companies will sell to the highest bidder. who is it that is the highest bidder right now? Who is it that's willing to pay more for oil than we are? We are in a global game. You need to understand the economics of our global position. China will pay more. So if we drill, and when I say we have the misconception that we're talking about the government. What I mean to say is if Exxon drills in Alaska and China is willing to pay more for that oil and they will refine it in China, where are they going to sell it? Are they going to sell it to us in the United States, in the lower 48, because we are Americans? Or are they going to sell it to China, who's willing to pay more? Are they going to sell it to us because we're Americans, or are they going to sell it to the Chinese? Who's going to give them the biggest profit? This is the reality. We hear about these political statements of drill, baby, drill. There hasn't been a refinery made in the United States in 40 years. It does not perfect the interest of Exxon to make another refinery so they can lower their price on themselves. They are more than happy to let people believe that somehow it's the government that is drilling, and when we drill, somehow we will be the the beneficiaries of that oil. If I ran Exxon, let me tell you, I'm not going to sell it to the Americans because I'm American. I've got shareholders. I've got my own stock options. I've got my compensation that is tied to performance. I'm going to sell it to whoever's going to pay me more. And if that's in China, great. So American oil is going to go where? Out the door. We have this misconception. And let me tell you something. Oil, the price of oil can fluctuate. Again, it's the refining capabilities that we have that are limiting us, and that is why the price of gasoline has not gone down commensurately percentage-wise as oil has. Otherwise, gasoline would be at around $1.90 a barrel, $2 a barrel. It's just not happening. Just not happening. Now, one of the reasons why we talk about economics and the definition of it is so we can understand the relationship. I want you to visually understand the relationship with politics, economics, and commodities on a global scale. And yes, we have ourselves another triangle. Maybe I should put it like this. But you need to know, you need to understand. Let's talk a little bit about gold. Gold, the world around, is a hedge against what? Why do people historically buy gold and large sums of it? Tell me why they buy gold in large sums of it. It's a hedge against inflation. It's a hedge against currencies that are weak or that can weaken. And we've been hearing for a long time that the US dollar is weak. Have we not? What do we need to compare it against? Tell me what we would compare the dollar to in terms of weakness. What would we compare? If you can't just tell me the dollar is weak. The dollar's got to be weak against something. Other currencies, number one. And then number two, excellent, Tim. Number two, previous value of the dollar. So historical prices, what you were able to get. So in terms of, was a dollar able to get you 2 loaves of bread, and now it's only able to get you 1? Historically, we need to make that comparison. Or, so we're talking about purchasing power, or against another currency. Or against another currency. So gold is a hedge against a weak dollar. Now we've been hearing again lots of weakness in the dollar. More recently, the dollar has been gaining strength against the euro and other currencies, and it's been losing some against other currencies as well. But what has gold done? What has gold been doing over the last 4 months? Tell me what the price of gold has. It been going through the roof? Because I'll tell you, if there's a lot of fears out there about the US dollar being weak, and again, there's no specificity on what it's weak against. We just hear in the media that the US dollar is weak. Down 25%. Is that in the last 4 months, Tim, or is that in the last few weeks? I think that's in the last few weeks. I believe that it hit a low, all-time low, well, I don't want to say all-time low, a low in the last few years yesterday. And this has a global impact because there are a lot of countries that are buying gold to prop up their currency. And when the value of gold goes down, so too does the value of their currency. Now, a currency is also going to be thrown into this equation. A currency is supposed to instill what? The currency is supposed to instill 2 types of things. One, Artemis, you got it. Confidence. What's the other one? What is the other characteristic? Liquidity, Randy. Thank you, Stephen. It's supposed to instill confidence and liquidity. I want to talk, we're going back and forth. Currencies now, commodities. Copper is down too because the Chinese stock market dropped 5% and China buys 40% of the world's copper. That's what the media is telling us. China is following in a delayed response what's going on in the United States. It's not the other way around. You notice that the Chinese markets have capitulated, meaning that they have fallen recently. What did the stock market do today? What is the stock market doing today? I believe it's up. And yet, the Chinese markets are still falling, and primarily because of their fears of an economic slowdown in the United States. And so they are buying less raw materials in the form of copper, aluminum, etc., etc. As the hegemon, the United States is the head of the global economic powers. It is the top. It is at the top of the pyramid. We remember this from class 1. Very rarely do you see the tail wag the dog, in the sense that what's happening in China will have an effect on the U.S. It's the other way around. You can have the tail wag the dog, but it doesn't happen for a long period of time. And Tim also points out that the Chinese, some of the Chinese banking systems, and I'm glad you brought this up. So when we say U.S. banks, are we talking about the U.S. banking system and our government, or are they separate? Is our government and the U.S. banking system separate? Yes, they are. In China, the Chinese banking system and the Chinese government are cohabitators. They are commingling their monies. They are married. They are one. So when Tim says that the Chinese central bank was stopping lending to rein in so-called shadow banking and gray market lending, how is that going to have an effect on the Chinese government, knowing that 60–70% of the Chinese market is what color? Gray. That's right. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Artemis. It's a gray market. So we have currency. We have currencies that are affected by, what are currencies affected by? What are currencies affected by? You tell me. You tell me, what are currencies affected by? I don't know the answer. That's absolutely right, Tim. It's interest rates. I do know the answer. Currencies are affected by interest rates. And what happened a few days ago? What happened last week? What did Ben Bernanke, the Fed chairman, state? How is he going to affect monetary policy? He was going to stop the quantitative easing. He was going to slow down by the end of this year the quantitative easing, which was essentially his way of stimulating the economy by buying about $80 billion worth of bonds every month. And what that does is that puts money into the economy. And it shook up the markets. It shook up the New York Stock Exchange and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It shook up the NASDAQ 2000. It shook up the S&P 500. It shook up the markets to a point that rippled globally into China, into Europe. And the US dollar had been gaining strength against the euro. And the quantitative easing that we just talked about is going to end at the end of this year, which means that, what are the implications, not only globally, but let me give you a real-time, real world. Because this is a topic du jour. As a student of the flow of funds, I don't like to call myself an economist. There's too much of a stigma to an economist, if you ask me. I am a student of the flow of funds, the velocity of money. What is the implications for you? What are the implications of this quantitative easing globally? I'll tell you, and it's very simple. It's very simple. Banks are going to be more and more, they're going to discriminate more when it comes to lending money. They're going to discriminate more when it comes to lending money. They've been lending money fairly freely recently, haven't they? Do you remember in 2009? I remember in 2009, prices were really low for houses, right? They just fell through the bottom. And my wife said, I think it's time to buy a house. And I said, okay, great. Let's go. And we were fortunate that we had funds available to buy a house. And I went to the bank and I said, all right, I want to buy a house. And what did the bank say? The bank said, no, Mr. Chavez. No, Senor Chavez. We can't do it unless you want to put down 100% of the money, we'll give you a loan. And I said, well, what? What kind of math is that? If I could put down 100% of the loan, why would I need you? And that was their policy in 2009. And then in 2010, it was 80%. And in 2011, it got down to 50%. And in 2012, the end of 2011, it was 20%. And now it's back down to 10%. Now it's back down to 10%. But the banks are going to be much more strict on who they lend to now. That's an implication. I should say that is a result of the Feds ending their quantitative easing by the end of this year. And that will slow housing sales because fewer people are going to qualify for loans because the banks are going to use more discretion. And what does that do as global students of the flow of funds? What does that do to the velocity of money? What does that do? I don't teach this class so that I can throw out a bunch of definitions. I need you to start putting two and two together, connect the dots, so you can infer from what I am implying or even outright stating that if banks are going to be less willing to loan, that the velocity of money will slow down in the housing market. And I'm not saying that this is 100% because no one knows what the future holds. This is just you and I talking over coffee and pastries. The housing market the large incline that we have seen in prices may become attenuated somewhat, meaning that it may start to level off. They may even come down a little bit. It slows down, as Ben says, as Artemis says, the velocity of money. So as global entrepreneurs, where do you want your money? Do you want it in housing? You see, the problem with housing is that people treat houses like a commodity. And now that we know the definition of a commodity, is a house a commodity? No, it is not. And for the first time in the United States history, housing was treated as a commodity in 2001 to 2008. Anybody could buy a house. I knew people that had no knowledge of real estate buying 2 and 3 houses and flipping them and leveraging themselves. Anybody could do it. And you're seeing that again. You're seeing people say, housing market, let's jump back into it. We'll pick up where we left off in 2005, in 2006, in 2008, when the financial crisis, when the black swan landed on our economy. Housing and houses are not commodities. So they have a little more of a vicious cycle to them, because more people want to speculate. Where do you want your money? Should it be in housing? And maybe it should. Maybe it should. I could be 100% wrong. But I am inferring from Mr. Bernanke's statements. And this is what you have to do. You have to connect dots. Where are you going to put that money? And here's the other thing. It has global repercussions. So the price of oil is going down because there is a sense that if the economies are going to slow down, then so too will demand for oil. So too will a demand for natural resources that Tim astutely pointed out that copper dropped to was it a 5-year low, Tim, yesterday because of China? Do you see the globalization? Do you see how this works? What is this that I'm showing you? Tell me what this means. I asked you when somebody said to define this, what does this mean? What does this mean? What is this a definition of? This is a definition of globalization. The threads that bind our economies together. The threads that bind our economies together. Currencies, interest rates, commodities, politics, economics. Now we're cooking with gas. Now we're cooking with gas. And this is the second to last day of our semester. And it boils down to commodities, currencies, politics, economics. And all of that is the velocity of money. Globally, think of where it's going. Think of the implications. Think of non-tariff barriers. Think of how we pulled all of this together today in class. Think of how the semester has molded your outlook. Think of how the semester will mold your opinions of where you might put some of your money, because at the end of the day, your career is going to be launched globally. You are a global manager, whether you like it or not. Would you like to work in another country? What country is it? And look at what the implications are of politics, commodities, currencies, economics. This is you right here. This is you right there. And you're going to have to understand the threads that bind our economies together. You're going to have to make some inferences. Understand the interactions. Of this. Understand this, the velocity of money, your careers, and have some, and there is another one. There is a hugely important, what is it that I'm missing here? What is it that I am missing here? Because currencies are a function of interest rates, right? What is it that I'm missing here? To tie this up and finish the day strong. Today's class has been a great day. To finish today strong, what is it that we are missing? Currencies, politics, commodities, economics. We could talk about also the environment. We could talk about the environment. What else? There is one other. Not necessarily labor. That's a good one, though. That is a good one. What else is it that I'm looking for? I'll tell you what I'm looking for. It's what we've been talking about all semester. Culture. 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 We need to have the cultural IQ in order to navigate our way through this maze. It's not enough to understand where the money is going, the velocity of money. How do I position myself into that market? How do I position myself into that country? And Tim says, China's refined copper imports fell 23% year over year in May. Since they account for 40% of the world's consumption, I didn't mean to say corruption, that was a Freudian slip. Since they account for 40% of the world's consumption, China provides essential support for futures on the London Metals Exchange and Commodities Exchange, etc. Well, we can translate that and say that goods are probably going to be cheaper. Let me ask you this. Have you ever thought of having anything made in China? Have you ever thought of having anything made in China? That may be a good time to have it made now, because what's happening? Prices are coming down for raw materials. Think, connect dots. One dot to another. What is it that you can do in this global environment? It's almost limitless. Where is it that you're going to put your energy? Where is it you're going to put your money? You tell me. I can connect dots all day long. But you need to connect the dots. Where might you want to? That's why we're taking this class. I would ask Ben, where might you want to connect some dots? Heck, Ben may want to open up a pastry shop for me. and start making crepes because the price of wheat is coming down because everybody is staying away from gluten. I don't know. But no, what I do know is that the velocity of money and that this dynamic of interactions, there are 6 of them that I have here. Connect the dots. Connect the dots. That's why you have an education. That's why you go to ASU, so that we can connect dots better than anyone else. All right. With that said, your homework is this. I want you on the discussion board to connect some dots. And don't be afraid about someone stealing your idea. Okay? There's more than enough room for several players, most likely. I want you on the discussion board to connect some dots. Tell me what it is that's going on in the economy. Tell me what's going on politically. Tell me what's going on culturally where you may be able to benefit and connect some dots. That's international business. Over and out. I'll see you guys on Thursday, same time, same channel. Great session. Great session, guys.